The story of the New World does not begin in 1492. It begins in a world already in motion, a world shaped by trade, religion, and empire. By the late 15th century, Europe stood at a crossroads. For centuries, the continent had been connected to Asia through the Silk Road, exchanging gold, silk, spices, and ideas. But this delicate network was fragile, and in 1453 it was violently shaken when Constantinople, the last outpost of the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Ottoman Turks. The conquest not only ended 1,000 years of Christian rule in the East, but also severed Europe's direct land access to Asia. Suddenly, the familiar routes to the riches of the East were blocked, and the price of spices and silk soared. In this climate of urgency, seafaring nations like Portugal and Spain began searching for new paths to Asia. Portugal had already launched daring expeditions along the coast of Africa. Under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors learned to master the winds and currents of the Atlantic, edging further south with every voyage. Their goal was clear: to round Africa and reach India by sea. By the 1480s, Bartolomé Diaz had already reached the Cape of Good Hope, and within a decade, Vasco da Gama would complete the journey to India. Spain, however, was late to the race. Locked in centuries of conflict during the Reconquista, Spain's energies had been consumed by the long war against the Moors. But in 1492, the year Granada fell and Spain was united under Ferdinand and Isabella, the kingdom turned its eyes outward. Hungry for wealth, eager to compete with Portugal, Spain was willing to gamble on bold ideas that most of Europe dismissed as madness. It was in this world that Christopher Columbus emerged. Born in Genoa, Italy, Columbus was a sailor who believed the shortest path to Asia was not around Africa, but across the Atlantic Ocean. He was not the first to dream of such a voyage, but he was the one stubborn enough to demand that kings and queens take him seriously. For years, he faced rejection and ridicule, until finally, in that fateful year of 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to fund his expedition. Yet while Europe prepared to launch its great gamble westward, across the Atlantic, a very different world thrived, one unknown to Europeans. The Americas were not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered, but a land of immense civilizations. In Mexico, the mighty Aztec Empire ruled over millions, its capital Tenochtitlan gleaming with temples, markets, and canals. In South America, the Inca Empire stretched across the Andes, with roads, stone cities, and terraced fields carved into mountains. And beyond these great powers, countless other societies flourished. The Maya, heirs of a once mighty civilization, the Mississippian mound builders of North America, the Taino, Arawak, and Carib peoples of the Caribbean islands. The world before 1492 was, in truth, two worlds. On one side, Europe, restless, ambitious, and searching for new routes to fortune. On the other, the Americas, diverse, complex, and unaware that the sails of foreign ships were about to appear on the horizon. The collision of these two worlds would change history forever. The year was 1492, a turning point not only for Spain but for the entire world. In the port of Palos de la Frontera, 3 small ships prepared for a voyage into the unknown: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Their leader was Christopher Columbus, a man burning with ambition, convinced that the Atlantic Ocean was not an endless void but a bridge to the riches of Asia. Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had taken a gamble on him. For them, the timing was symbolic. With the fall of Granada earlier that same year, the Reconquista was complete. Spain had been united under the Christian crown, and victory gave the monarchs a sense of destiny. If their armies could reclaim the Iberian Peninsula, why should their ships not conquer the seas? Funding Columbus's voyage was not just about trade, it was about prestige, power, and faith. On the 3rd of August, 1492, the 3 ships slipped their moorings and set out into the Atlantic. For weeks they sailed westward, carried by the steady trade winds. At first, spirits were high, but as days turned into weeks, doubts crept in. The ocean seemed endless, supplies dwindled, and the men whispered of turning back. Fear and mutiny loomed over the expedition. Columbus, however, was relentless. He inspired, threatened, and cajoled his men, insisting that land was near. He kept two sets of logs, one true, one false, to ease their worries. Then, in the early hours of October 12, 1492, a shout pierced the night. Tierra, tierra, land had been sighted. The ships anchored off the shores of what we now know as the Bahamas, and Columbus stepped ashore, planting the banner of Castile and Leon into the sand. He believed he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. In reality, he had arrived at a new world, though he did not know it. The first encounters were with the Taino people, who greeted the strangers with curiosity and generosity. They brought gifts of food, cotton, and parrots, marveling at the strange men in iron and their towering ships. Columbus, in turn, saw opportunity. He wrote in his journal that the Taino would make good servants, noting their lack of weapons and eagerness to trade. What began as peaceful exchanges carried the shadow of conquest. The voyage continued through the Caribbean. Columbus charted islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, convinced he was skirting the edges of Asia. But behind the exploration lay something darker. The Spaniards took captives, demanded gold, and planted crosses, claiming the lands for Spain and for Christendom. Seeds of empire were already being sown. When Columbus finally returned to Spain in March 1493, he arrived not as a dreamer but as a hero. He brought with him exotic plants, animals, and a handful of Taino captives. His tales of vast new lands and endless wealth electrified Europe. The voyage had succeeded, and Spain's gamble had paid off beyond imagination. But what Columbus did not realize was that his discovery had set in motion forces that could never be undone. Behind him, two worlds had made contact, and nothing would ever be the same again. When Columbus returned to Spain in triumph, he was hailed as the man who had opened the gates of Asia. What followed was a frenzy of ambition. In 1493, he set out on a second voyage, this time not with 3 small ships, but with a fleet of 17 vessels and over 1,000 men. The age of discovery had become an age of conquest. The Caribbean islands, lush and green, became the first stage of European colonization. Columbus and his men built settlements, the most famous being La Navidad on the island of Hispaniola. But almost immediately, tension began to rise between Spaniards and the indigenous Taino people. At first, the Taino welcomed the strangers with hospitality, sharing food, guiding them through forests, and showing them rivers of gold dust. Yet the Spaniards' hunger for wealth was insatiable. Columbus's men demanded tribute in gold, enslaved villagers, and punished resistance with brutal violence. The Taino way of life, built on farming, fishing, and community, was shattered under this relentless pressure. Conflict flared. Some Taino resisted with bows and arrows, but Spanish steel, horses, and gunpowder overwhelmed them. Disease, too silent and invisible, spread with devastating speed. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through villages, killing tens of thousands. For the first time, the old world's germs reached the new, beginning one of history's deadliest biological catastrophes. Within a generation, entire islands were depopulated. The Taino, once the proud people of the Caribbean, faced near extinction. To the Spanish, the islands became footholds, launching pads for further expeditions deeper into the Americas. From Hispaniola, Cuba was claimed, then Puerto Rico, then Jamaica. Each new colony was marked by the same pattern: settlement, conquest, forced labor, and collapse of the native population. Columbus himself, once celebrated as a hero, saw his reputation begin to tarnish. Reports of his cruelty, his harsh governance, and his failures to maintain order in the colonies reached Spain. Even his allies turned against him. By the end of his life, Columbus had fallen from grace, stripped of titles, clinging bitterly to the belief that he had reached Asia. Yet the momentum of conquest had already escaped his grasp. The Caribbean colonies were more than just outposts. They were the testing ground of empire. Here, Spain learned the methods it would use for centuries: forced tribute, enslavement, conversion to Christianity, and extraction of resources. These islands became Spain's laboratories of imperial power, and from them, the great thrust into the mainland would soon begin. For the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, however, this was the beginning of the end. Their world, which had flourished for centuries, was collapsing in a matter of decades. What had begun with curiosity and cautious welcome had transformed into domination and devastation. And this was only the first chapter in a much larger story of conquest that would engulf an entire hemisphere. By the early 1500s, the Spanish crown had turned its attention from the Caribbean islands to the vast mainland across the Gulf. Stories trickled back to Hispaniola and Cuba of lands rich in gold, filled with cities larger and grander than anything in Europe. For ambitious men, this was a call too tempting to ignore. Among them was Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from Spain who saw in the New World an opportunity for glory beyond his birth. In 1519, Cortés sailed from Cuba with a small force, about 600 soldiers, a handful of horses, and a few cannons. By European standards, it was a pitiful army, but what he lacked in numbers, Cortés made up for in audacity. He landed on the coast of Mexico and quickly began forging alliances with indigenous peoples who had long suffered under the dominance of the mighty Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, ruled by Emperor Moctezuma II from their dazzling capital of Tenochtitlan, commanded tribute from dozens of subject tribes. Resentment simmered, and Cortés exploited it, presenting himself as a liberator rather than an invader. As the Spaniards marched inland, they encountered civilizations unlike anything they had ever seen. Towering pyramids, marketplaces filled with goods, and roads that stretched for miles across mountains and valleys. The Aztecs, at first, watched these pale-skinned strangers with both curiosity and dread. Some believed Cortés might be linked to a prophecy of Quetzalcoatl, a god said to return from the east. Moctezuma himself hesitated, uncertain whether to crush the intruders or welcome them. When Cortés and his men finally reached Tenochtitlan, they were awestruck. The city rose from the middle of a great lake, connected by causeways and lined with canals. With gleaming temples, palaces, and bustling markets, it rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, any European capital. For a moment, two worlds stood face to face. But peace was fleeting. The Spaniards, greedy for gold and contemptuous of Aztec rituals, quickly turned relations sour. They seized Moctezuma, holding him hostage in his own palace, and tried to rule through him. Outrage spread through the city. Tensions erupted into open violence. In the chaos, Moctezuma was killed, whether by Spanish hands or his own people remains debated. The Spaniards fled the city during the infamous La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, suffering heavy losses as Aztec warriors drove them out. Yet Cortés did not give up. He regrouped, forged stronger alliances with Aztec enemies, and returned with a vengeance. With thousands of indigenous allies at his side and smallpox already ravaging the Aztec population, Cortés laid siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521. For months, the city resisted bravely, but hunger, disease, and relentless Spanish assault eventually broke its defenses. The once great capital was reduced to rubble. The Aztec Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations of the Americas, had fallen. In its place, the Spaniards built Mexico City atop the ruins, making it the jewel of Spain's new empire. The conquest of the Aztecs was both brutal and transformative. It signaled not just the collapse of one empire but the dawn of a new world order. Gold and silver would soon flow from Mexico to Spain, fueling Europe's rise, while the indigenous peoples faced a future of subjugation, forced conversion, and cultural upheaval. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked a turning point. Spain had proven that with cunning, alliances, and disease as an unintentional ally, even the mightiest of American empires could be toppled. And soon, they would turn their gaze south, toward the Andes and the empire of the Inca. While Cortés was carving out Spain's dominion in Mexico, another Spanish adventurer dreamed of even greater riches to the south. His name was Francisco Pizarro, a hardened soldier of humble origins, ruthless and relentless. By the 1530s, tales of a vast empire high in the Andes reached Spanish ears, an empire said to be overflowing with gold and silver. This was the Inca Empire, stretching thousands of miles across mountains and valleys, its roads, terraces, and stone fortresses unlike anything Europeans had seen. The Inca, ruled from their capital at Cusco, commanded millions of subjects through an intricate system of administration and labor tribute. But when Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men, the empire was already in turmoil. A brutal civil war had just ended between two royal brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar. Atahualpa emerged victorious, but the conflict had weakened the empire, leaving it vulnerable to foreign opportunists. In 1532, Pizarro lured Atahualpa to a meeting in the town of Cajamarca. The Spaniards came armed with steel, horses, and gunpowder weapons. The Inca came in thousands but unarmed, expecting a peaceful parley. What followed was a massacre. The Spaniards launched a surprise attack, slaughtering the Inca nobles and capturing Atahualpa himself. The Inca ruler, though treated with respect outwardly, became a prisoner of the foreigners. Atahualpa, desperate to secure his release, offered the Spaniards a ransom beyond imagination. He promised to fill an entire room with gold and silver, treasures of temples and palaces. Over the following months, the Incas delivered on this promise, stripping their sacred shrines of precious metal. The Spaniards melted it down into bars and shipped it back to Spain. Yet once the ransom was paid, Atahualpa was not freed. Instead, he was tried on charges of treason, idolatry, and murder. In 1533, the last sovereign emperor of the Inca was executed, strangled or burned, depending on the accounts. The death of Atahualpa shattered the empire's unity. Pizarro and his men marched into Cusco, seizing the city and dismantling the empire piece by piece. Like in Mexico, disease swept through the Andes, decimating the population and leaving villages empty. Resistance did not vanish entirely. Inca leaders like Manco Inca mounted fierce rebellions from mountain strongholds, but the tide of conquest was unstoppable. The Inca Empire, which had risen in less than a century to dominate South America, collapsed in only a few years under Spanish assault. In its place rose the Viceroyalty of Peru, the center of Spain's wealth in the New World. From the silver mines of Potosi to the fertile valleys of the Andes, the riches of the Inca world poured into European markets, fueling Spain's golden age and reshaping global trade. But for the Andean peoples, the conquest meant devastation. Their temples were desecrated, their traditions suppressed, and their labor exploited under the brutal encomienda system. Yet, even under Spanish rule, echoes of Inca culture endured, hidden in rituals, language, and resistance. The empire had fallen, but its legacy would never entirely die. The conquest of the Inca, like that of the Aztecs, revealed the deadly formula of Europe's expansion: small armies, native allies, advanced weaponry, ruthless leaders, and above all, the silent ally of disease. Together, these forces allowed Spain to topple civilizations that had stood for centuries. And with both Mexico and Peru under its control, Spain had become the most powerful empire in the world. With the fall of both the Aztec and Inca empires, Spain stood astride a vast new dominion. But conquest was only the beginning. What followed was one of the most transformative processes in all of human history: the Columbian Exchange. This was not a single event, but an immense, ongoing transfer of people, plants, animals, technologies, and diseases across the Atlantic Ocean, reshaping the world forever. From the Americas, crops unknown in Europe, Asia, and Africa began to spread: maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, chili peppers, and tobacco. These foods would revolutionize global diets. Potatoes, rich in calories, became a staple in Europe, especially in Ireland and Russia, fueling population growth. Maize and cassava would feed millions across Africa and Asia, sustaining empires that never knew their origins lay in distant American soil. The humble tomato transformed Mediterranean cuisine, and chocolate, once sacred to the Maya and Aztecs, became a coveted luxury in European courts. In return, Europeans brought their own animals and crops across the ocean. Horses, unknown in the Americas for thousands of years, thundered across the plains once more, transforming Native American cultures, especially in the Great Plains of North America. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats reshaped landscapes and diets. Wheat and sugarcane, introduced to the Caribbean and South America, became staples of plantation economies, industries that would soon demand vast amounts of labor. But not all exchanges brought prosperity. Diseases carried across the Atlantic, smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, devastated indigenous populations. In the Caribbean, Mexico, and the Andes, entire communities collapsed, with mortality rates reaching 70 to 90%. For Native Americans, the arrival of Europeans was not just conquest but biological catastrophe. This demographic collapse made resistance difficult and allowed Spain to cement its dominance with relatively small forces. Meanwhile, new forms of wealth reshaped global economies. Silver from the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico poured into Spain. Vast quantities of bullion crossed the Atlantic, fueling European wars, funding the Spanish crown, and eventually destabilizing the global economy through inflation. Much of this silver even reached China, linking the Americas to Asia in a global trade network for the first time. The Columbian Exchange also spread European technologies, iron tools, firearms, and sailing ships into the Americas, accelerating both cultural blending and the disruption of indigenous traditions. Catholic missionaries carried Christianity into every corner of Spain's new empire, converting millions but also erasing sacred practices. New languages, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, took root, forming the linguistic map of Latin America today. Yet the exchange was not one-sided. Native American influences penetrated deeply into European life. The craving for tobacco reshaped economies and societies. Chocolate became a symbol of luxury. Corn fed armies and peasants alike. In less than a century, the diets, economies, and cultures of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas were transformed by this intercontinental current. The Columbian Exchange was, in truth, the birth of globalization. No region of the world would remain untouched. It brought new abundance, new connections, and new opportunities, but also unimaginable suffering, exploitation, and cultural loss. The world of 1600 was fundamentally different from that of 1492, and at its heart was this great collision of continents. And yet, one of the darkest aspects of this new system was just beginning to take shape. The rise of the transatlantic slave trade, which would carry millions of Africans across the ocean in chains. As Spain and later other European powers carved out empires in the New World, the question of labor became unavoidable. The vast plantations of sugarcane in the Caribbean, the sprawling haciendas of Mexico, and the silver mines of Peru demanded a constant, grueling workforce. At first, the conquerors sought to use indigenous labor under the encomienda system, forcing native communities to work for Spanish overlords. But this system quickly collapsed under the combined weight of exploitation, overwork, and above all, epidemic disease. By the mid-1500s, much of the Caribbean's native population had been wiped out. Faced with labor shortages, Europeans turned to Africa. The idea was not new. Slavery had existed in Africa, Europe, and the Islamic world for centuries. But the scale and brutality of what came next was unprecedented. Portuguese traders had already established posts along the West African coast, exchanging goods for human captives. Now, this trade expanded dramatically, feeding the insatiable labor demands of the Americas. Millions of men, women, and children were seized or sold into slavery, marched to coastal forts, and crammed aboard ships in conditions of unimaginable horror. The Middle Passage, as the voyage across the Atlantic was known, was a nightmare. Shackled together in dark, suffocating holds, captives endured starvation, disease, and abuse. Mortality rates were staggering. Estimates suggest that 15 to 20% of Africans perished before even reaching the New World. Those who survived were sold in bustling slave markets from Havana to Cartagena to Veracruz. They became the backbone of plantation economies, particularly in sugar production, which demanded backbreaking labor under the tropical sun. Later, African labor would also be crucial in tobacco, cotton, and coffee cultivation, all of which became global commodities. The wealth of Europe was built, in no small part, on the suffering of enslaved Africans. The human toll was immense. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Entire regions of West and Central Africa were destabilized as kingdoms rose and fell through their participation in the trade. Families were torn apart, communities depopulated, and cultural continuity shattered. Yet despite the unimaginable cruelty, African traditions, music, and spiritual practices endured. Across the Americas, enslaved peoples forged new identities, blending their heritage with European and indigenous influences. These cultural legacies, whether in language, religion, food, or music, remain vibrant today. The transatlantic slave trade was not just an economic system, it was a crime against humanity on a massive scale. It tied together three continents in what historians call the triangular trade. European goods went to Africa, enslaved Africans to the Americas, and American commodities back to Europe. This triangle of exploitation fueled the rise of capitalism, enriched European empires, and permanently scarred the African continent. By the 17th century, slavery and the slave trade had become the foundation of European colonial power. It was one of the darkest legacies of the Age of Discovery, a system that would persist for centuries, even as its moral costs grew ever clearer. By the early 1600s, Spain's monopoly over the New World was being challenged. For nearly a century after Columbus, Spain and Portugal had dominated the seas, sanctioned by the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which divided the globe between them. But new powers were rising: France, England, and the Netherlands, each determined to carve out their own place in this emerging Atlantic world. The French began their ventures in North America, establishing colonies in Canada and along the Mississippi River. They sought wealth through fur trading rather than gold, forging alliances with indigenous nations. Unlike the Spanish, whose encounters often led to destruction, the French relied on cooperation and diplomacy, though not without conflict. The English, meanwhile, launched colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, beginning with Jamestown in 1607. Unlike the Spanish, who ruled vast centralized empires, the English settlements were smaller, often founded by private companies or religious groups. Over time, these would grow into powerful colonies with their own identities, economies, and tensions. The Dutch, though a smaller nation, made a disproportionate impact. With their powerful navy and merchant fleet, they established trading posts in the Caribbean and along the Hudson River, founding New Amsterdam, later New York. Dutch merchants dominated the sugar trade, and their financial innovations helped fuel global commerce. As these powers expanded, the Atlantic became a zone of constant conflict. Spanish treasure fleets, carrying silver and gold from the Americas, were hunted by English and Dutch privateers, state-sponsored pirates like Francis Drake. Naval battles erupted across the seas, while colonies changed hands in wars that stretched from Europe to the Caribbean. The Caribbean became a battleground. Sugar islands like Barbados, Saint Domingue, and Jamaica were among the most valuable pieces of land in the world, contested fiercely by European empires. Colonization here relied almost entirely on enslaved African labor, making the region one of the most brutal theaters of the slave trade. These rivalries reshaped the Americas. The Spanish Empire, though still vast, began to decline under the pressure of competition, wars, and economic troubles. The English and French steadily expanded, while the Dutch carved out strategic footholds. The Age of Discovery had given way to an age of empire, where the New World was no longer just about exploration, it was about domination. Yet beneath the clash of European powers, indigenous peoples continued to resist and adapt. In North America, alliances shifted constantly as native nations sought to use European rivalries to their advantage. Some prospered through trade, others suffered through displacement and warfare. Across the continent, indigenous agency remained a crucial, though often overlooked, force in shaping events. By the 1700s, the Americas were a mosaic of competing powers, cultures, and economies, bound together by trade, war, and slavery. The discovery of the New World had become not just Spain's story, but the story of an entire globe now locked in competition for wealth and power. When Europeans first set foot in the Americas, they encountered civilizations as diverse and complex as those of Europe itself. From the Taino of the Caribbean to the Powhatan in Virginia, from the Aztec and Inca empires to the countless smaller nations that dotted the continent, the New World was not an empty land. It was a vibrant mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions. But the arrival of Europeans set in motion a demographic catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. The spread of Old World diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, ravaged populations with no prior immunity. In some regions, mortality rates reached 80 to 90% within a few generations. What armies and cannons could not achieve, microbes did with terrifying efficiency. Yet the narrative of indigenous peoples is not only one of loss. Across the Americas, communities fought fiercely to preserve their lands, cultures, and autonomy. The Mapuche of Chile resisted Spanish domination for centuries. In North America, the Iroquois Confederacy played European powers against one another, carving out influence through diplomacy and war. In the Andes, rebellions flared for generations after the fall of the Inca Empire, keeping alive the hope of freedom. Resistance also took subtle forms. Some indigenous groups converted to Christianity but blended it with their own traditions, creating syncretic religions that preserved native beliefs under a new guise. Others adapted to European tools, horses, or firearms, reshaping their societies in ways that gave them new strengths. Despite resilience, the demographic collapse reshaped the Americas. Vast territories depopulated by disease and war were opened for European settlement. Entire ecosystems shifted as indigenous farming practices declined, and forests regrew in abandoned lands. This ecological change was part of what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, and people between the Old and New Worlds. The loss of so many lives also accelerated the reliance on enslaved Africans, permanently altering the demographics of the Americas. By the 1700s, in places like the Caribbean and Brazil, Africans and their descendants formed the majority of the population, creating societies unlike anything Europe had known. Still, indigenous peoples endured. Despite centuries of colonization, assimilation, and violence, their descendants remain, carrying forward languages, traditions, and spiritual practices into the modern world. Their survival is a testament to resilience against overwhelming odds. In the great story of the New World, indigenous resistance reminds us that history is not simply a tale of European conquest, but a struggle of peoples whose voices, though often silenced, never disappeared. By the dawn of the 18th century, the discovery of the New World had reshaped the globe in ways few could have imagined in 1492. What began as a voyage across the Atlantic had triggered a chain reaction that connected continents, toppled empires, and gave rise to a new global system of power and trade. At the heart of this transformation was the Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of plants, animals, people, and ideas between the Old and New Worlds. Potatoes, maize, and tomatoes revolutionized European diets, fueling population growth. Horses and cattle transformed indigenous societies in the Americas, especially on the Great Plains. Meanwhile, sugar, coffee, and tobacco, cultivated by enslaved labor, became staples of European consumption, weaving the fates of three continents into a single, interconnected system. But this new world came at an enormous cost. The Atlantic slave trade, which had grown alongside colonization, became one of the darkest engines of economic growth. Millions of Africans were torn from their homelands, their suffering underwriting the wealth of European empires and laying the foundation for the racial hierarchies that would scar centuries to come. The balance of power among European nations also shifted. Spain's early dominance gave way to an age of competition, where England, France, and the Netherlands fought for supremacy not only in the Americas but across Africa and Asia as well. The Caribbean islands became the jewels of empire, fought over in wars that spanned oceans. Trade routes grew into lifelines of wealth, guarded by powerful navies. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the new order was one of loss and adaptation. Entire civilizations had collapsed, yet survivors carried forward traditions and forged new identities under colonial rule. Across the continent, their presence and resistance remained, challenging the notion that conquest had been complete. The global consequences extended even further. The influx of silver from the Americas destabilized economies in Europe and Asia, fueling inflation and transforming global trade. European consumer culture expanded, driven by products grown in the Americas. And most significantly, the Americas themselves became the stage for new societies, where Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples interacted, clashed, and blended in ways that would shape the future. By the 18th century, the Atlantic world had become the center of global history. Empires rose and fell not in isolation, but in connection with distant continents. The discovery of the New World had, in truth, created a new world order, one defined by intercontinental exchange, imperial rivalry, and the birth of a truly global economy. The legacy of this era is still with us. From the foods we eat to the languages we speak, from the inequalities we grapple with to the cultural blends that enrich our lives, the world today carries the marks of that moment when Columbus set sail in 1492. It was, without doubt, one of the great turning points in human history, a story of exploration and ambition, but also of conquest, suffering, and resilience. The discovery of the New World did not just change maps, it changed the destiny of the world itself.